So welcome back from the break. Let's take a look at the two concept check questions so we can move on and start talking about gymnosperms, which is the next topic of discussion. So compare how the sperm of seedless plants reach the eggs with how the same process occurs in seeded plants. Well, remember, seedless plants have flagellated sperm. So the sperm of seedless plants exits from the antheridium, the male gametangium, and swim through the water, either over a long distance if it's bryophytes, or over a shorter distance if it's the ferns, because remember, in the ferns, the gametophyte has both gametangia on it. But nonetheless, whether we're talking about non-vascular plants or seedless vascular plants, the sperm swim from the antheridium to the archegonium, through the top of the archegonium, swim down the neck of the archegonium into the body of the archegonium where the egg is located, and then fertilize the egg. So it's all about the sperm swimming. How did the sperm of seeded plants reach the egg? Well, the sperm in the form of the sperm nucleus contained within the gametophyte, which is the pollen grain, is carried by the wind or by a pollinating vector, which could be an insect or an animal or a bird, is carried to the flower or to the cone if it's a gymnosperm. It then enters into the ovule through the micropyle. It then germinates and produces a pollen tube that allows the sperm nucleus to enter into the region of the gametophyte that contains the egg nucleus, and fertilization occurs. Now, you're going to see a modified version of that in angiosperms, but that's the general principle in play as far as the sperm nucleus getting to the egg in seeded plants. What derived features of seeded plants not present in seedless plants have led to the success of seeded plants on land? Well, those would be the 5 derived traits that we talked about at length in the previous section. So those would be the reduction of the gametophyte so that it is contained within the body of the sporophyte, the heterosporous condition leading to the development of seeds, which is number 3. Then in conjunction with the heterosporous condition, we have the emergence of a megaspore that gives rise to the egg, and a microspore that gives rise to the sperm. And in the case of the megaspore, that is contained within the body of the female part of the plant, within the gametophyte, which is contained within the sporophyte. In the case of the microspore, that is produced in the microsporangium packaged in the gametophyte in the form of the pollen grain, which can then be carried to the female part of the plant or to another plant in the absence of water, because it is protected by a hydrophobic coating that prevents drying out and does not rely or does not require the presence of water for transmission. It's not flagellated. So there are the 5 derived traits of seeded plants that have led to their success on dry land as probably the ultimate expression of plant colonization of dry land and utilization of dry land as a habitat. So let's go on and take a look at gymnosperms. So there are 4 phyla contained within the gymnosperm clade. We're not entirely sure what is the evolutionary relationship between these 4 phyla, but nonetheless, they do share common DNA sequences. And so on that basis, we do believe that these 4 phyla do represent a single clade in the form of the gymnosperms. what does gymnosperm mean? Well, it means naked seed. Oops. So let's just write that in. And what is meant by that is that the ovule is exposed. Its only protection is the integument. So it's kind of exposed to the environment. Now, in those gymnosperms that have a cone-like structure, which is the conifers and the gonidophytes, the seed has a further layer of protection in that it is usually enclosed within the cone, but the seed has no further covering over it other than the integument itself. So that's why we refer to these as naked seeds. And remember, the ovule is what is going to eventually develop into the seed. So the four clades that are found within the gymnosperm, or the four phyla that are contained within the gymnosperm clade, are the cycadophyta, the cycads. These are tropical or semi-tropical in most cases. They have a relatively worldwide distribution. I used to be able to take people on a short field trip when we were on campus and show in the cycads, because we used to have cycads on campus. If you happen to have access to a plant called a sago palm, sago palms are actually cycads. They don't really look like a cycad. They look a little bit more like a truncated palm tree, but they are in fact cycads. And you see this most particularly when they are reproducing, because there are individual male and female plants, and they have very distinct strobili or cones. And once the ovules are pollinated, you can very easily see the naked seeds on the female plants because they have a very bright red seed coat over the top of them. Once the integuments dry out and the seeds are ready for release, you see this very bright red seed coat laying over completely encapsulating the mature seed inside. The next clade, or the next phylum, is Ginkgophyta. There is only a single surviving species, and our current feeling is that this is extinct in the wild because it's a native of Eastern China, and given the rate of development in China and the loss of habitat in China, we think that the ginkgos are essentially extinct in the wild now, and this has probably been true for quite some time. The single species is Ginkgo biloba. You may have heard of it. You have certainly seen it if you've spent any time in downtown Orlando, because ginkgos are highly valued in urban landscapes because they are very resistant to both urban pollution and to insects. Again, as we've seen in the cycads, there are males and females. So there are male ginkgos and female ginkgos. It is only the male ginkgos that are typically grown in the urban landscape. And that is because the female ginkgos, after the seeds develop from the ovules, drop all of that material on the ground, which leaves a lot of plant litter under the trees and requires a large amount of work to clean up, whereas the males don't do that. And so it reduces the burden on the cities to keep the sidewalks clean if they only have the males growing in the urban landscape. Of course, if you want to produce new ginkgos, you still have to have males and females. There, depending on what the emphasis is, you may have more males than females, or you may have more females than males, because obviously you need a lot of female trees in order to get the seeds, in order to produce the next generation of plants. Ginkgophyta, we have one of the three genera represented here in the United States in the form of ephedra plants, the native ephedras of the Western deserts. It is commonly referred to as Mormon tea. I'll show you a picture of it a little bit later. By virtue of the fact that when the Mormons first entered into the Great Salt Lake region, they found these plants, and apparently they turned some of that plant material into a tea-like drink by brewing up some of the dry plant material. It is also a source of a drug called ephedrine, which has been used as a decongestant in cough mixtures, but it is not permitted in anything other than cough mixtures. It used to be used in energy drinks until it was discovered that drinking a lot of energy drinks with ephedrine in it, or ephedrine in it, would lead to heart damage. And a number of individuals died as a consequence of this, including individuals within the US military. Excuse me. Which got everyone's attention, because these were young, healthy individuals who should not have underlying heart conditions that were dying of apparent heart damage and heart attack. And it was eventually traced back to the presence of the ephedrine in the energy drinks that they were consuming large quantities of. So it's now illegal to use ephedrine in anything other than cough mixture. And for various reasons, cough mixture requires an adult for purchase, and you have to be able to demonstrate your age by showing your identification. Try buying cough mixture at the supermarket and you'll see what I mean, or at over the counter at the pharmacy, because they are supposed to check your ID. This is one of the reasons why. The last clade and the largest clade is the Coniferous phyta, the conifers. There are about 600 species present in this clade, of which 4 have very significant industrial significance, because it is those 4 conifers that provide us with all our building timber and the source of raw materials for making all of our paper products. Just 4 species of conifers, and in fact, it's only conifers that we use for producing those materials. So the next time you build something from timber, or you see a house going up, or an apartment complex, and they're doing the framing in timber, that's conifer. If you are looking at particle board or something like that, that's all made out of conifers, wood chips. And all of the paper that you use, every scrap of paper, until very recently, was made out of conifers, with the push to be more environmentally sensitive and to use more or to use materials that put less strain on land resources. Some paper products and some materials are now being made out of bamboo, and it's surprising what you can actually make out of bamboo. It's a very flexible material. But the vast majority of paper products are still made out of conifer. And if you go up to Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, you can drive past large man-made plantations of conifers that are used for chipping, because it's wood chips that are then converted into paper, and it's either used in the paper mills along the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia, or it's shipped overseas to be used for making paper in other countries. So this shows you the position of the gymnosperms in the phylogenetic tree. Let's move on. So where do gymnosperms come from? That's a really good question. In the Devonian, we see evidence of the emergence of the heterosporous condition via a group of now extinct plants called the progymnosperms, an example of which is Archaeopteris, and I've got a picture of Archaeopteris on the next page. So the transcript service is reading it as Archaeopteryx, which is a early representative of the birds, perhaps an early ancestor of the birds, but Archaeopteris is the is a member of the progymnosperms. These have fern-like leaves. They are very tree-like in appearance. They probably grow to about 20 meters, so roughly 60 to 70 feet in height. So they're very tree-like and they're woody, but they don't have seeds, but they are heterosporous. So we think that it may very well be the progymnosperms that are the earliest ancestors of gymnosperms, showing the heterosporous condition, or at least the earliest ancestors of seed plants. True gymnosperms are evident in the late Carboniferous, but they really only start to dominate the landscape in the late Jurassic and early Mesozoic, early Cretaceous. We don't actually see pollen grains that we can identify as gymnosperm pollen grains until we get to the Cretaceous. And so it is likely that gymnosperms as seeded plants, as true seeded plants, probably don't emerge until the Cretaceous. We also see the earliest evidence of angiosperms in the late Cretaceous. So the emergence of seed plants as two distinct clades, as gymnosperms and angiosperms, really only takes place in the Cretaceous. And the reason why we are fairly confident that the gymnosperms are emerging there, because it appears that some of the earliest true gymnosperms were actually pollinated by insects, and we have several fossil insects that bear pollen grains that are very much gymnosperm pollen grains, and these are derived from the very early Cretaceous, that last period of the Mesozoic. But we don't see pollen grains of that type at all in the Jurassic, so it's unlikely that they appear in a large number until we get to the Cretaceous. That being said, some gymnosperms have a clear evidence throughout the period, particularly of the Jurassic, in the form of the cycads and the conifers. These are the plants that really form the basis for herbivorous dinosaurs. Now, I know that seems to be somewhat inconsistent, that we don't see the fossil evidence of gymnosperms in large numbers until we get to the Cretaceous. And we don't see fossils of gymnosperm pollen until we get to the Cretaceous in large amounts. That doesn't mean that gymnosperms are not present. It just means that we don't have significant fossil evidence. But we do think, from what evidence we do have, particularly of the Jurassic ecosystems and the stomachs of herbivorous dinosaurs, that gymnosperms were present and probably formed a significant part of the diet of the herbivorous dinosaurs that dominate our thinking when we think Jurassic. Remember that T-Rex is actually a Cretaceous dinosaur, not a Jurassic dinosaur. If you're thinking meat-eating dinosaurs of the Jurassic, you're thinking allosaurs. So it gets a little bit difficult to try and explain the origin of gymnosperms because the fossil record is a little bit fuzzy on that. But we do have a feeling, and this is, I mean, and it might sound like I'm waffling a little bit here because I'm very much aware of the uncertainty and probably a little bit of the confusion that this may be creating for you as you're listening to this. One of the reasons why people have the impression that large conifers and large gymnosperms truly dominated the landscape of the Jurassic is because of Jurassic Park. If you go back and look at the original Jurassic Park and you see the first encounter of the outside paleontologists with the dinosaurs within Jurassic Park, they climb conifers and feed cycad material to the herbivorous dinosaurs. And that kind of reinforces this notion that the Jurassic landscape was dominated by conifers and large gymnosperms. It wasn't. There's still evidence of the ferns and their relatives up into the Triassic. We see some gymnosperms appearing in the early to mid-Jurassic as potential food sources for the herbivorous dinosaurs, and probably did represent a significant part of the diet of herbivorous dinosaurs, but we don't see a significant fossil record of gymnosperms until we move to the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. It is what it is. So this is a progymnosperm. This is Archaefructus. Did I get that? No, sorry, Archaeopteris. Archaefructus is an early angiosperm. Sorry about that. This is Archaeopteris, and you can see that it looks like a tree. It has the fern-like leaves arrangement. It was heterosporous, but it did not bear seeds. So we talk about the phylums in a little bit of detail in this next section, just a quick introduction to each of the phyla. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these, just give you a little bit of background information, show you a couple of pictures, and then move through the phyla. So phylum Cicadophyta, if I recall correctly, there's about 35 species extant today. There's a larger representation in the fossil record. This is an example that is often referred to, Cycas revoluta. This is one of the native cycads to the United States. You can see the strobilus, the cone-like structure here, built out of sporophylls, in this case, these will be megasporophylls, because this is a female cone. If it reminds you a little bit of a conifer cone, that's good, because it is the same basic type of structure. Remember, these are both gymnosperms, and so it's the same basic type of structure. When the seeds finally develop, the megasporophylls of the strobilus will open up, and you'll be able to see the seeds at the base of the sporophylls. That's where the sporangia are located, that give rise to the spore structures the megasporangium that gives rise to the ovule, or is contained within the ovule. Ginkgo phyta, otherwise not, Ginkgo biloba is the only extant species otherwise known as the maidenhair tree. So maybe I'll put that in here. Maidenhair tree. So that's the common name for Ginkgo biloba. And as I said, you can see this in downtown Orlando. This is a picture of a maidenhair tree growing in an urban landscape. I'm not sure where this is taken from, but it's probably somewhere up in the northeast, I would expect. Here are the seeds, the ovules. So there's the integument, the fleshy layer protecting the underlying ovule. This will dry out once the embryonic plant inside the ovule has matured and form the seed coat, and then that will be released. It'll simply drop off the tree. So you can see where the name gymnosperm comes from, this idea of a naked seed. There's no attempt to enclose this at all. Phylum Ginkgo phyta is typically a desert plant. You're going to probably not encounter too many representatives of these unless you see them in a herbarium. because they live mostly in Southeast Asia and Africa, and particularly the example that's here, Welwitschia is found in the deserts of Southwest Africa. Gonitum comes from Asia, as I recall. You can see it has a very cone-like structure. Here are the ovulate cones. These are the female cones. So let me make a notation here so that you're aware of this. This is, oops, activated pen. So ovulate is the name that's given to the female cones. Staminate is the name given to the male cone. And that's consistent across the board for gymnosperms. Ovulate refers to the fact that that's where the ovules are located. Staminate refers to the fact that the pollen producing feature within the male cones is the stamen. It's also the name that's given to the pollen producing structure within a flower. So that's where the term staminate comes from, the fact that it produces the pollen. This is ephedra. This is the native ephedra species to the United States. Again, it's a desert plant found in the deserts of the Southwest, otherwise known as Mormon tea, and the source of ephedrine. Most ephedrine these days is actually sourced from another member of the ephedra genus that is found in China. It is a different plant, but it nonetheless produces ephedrine as well, or ephedrine as well. Then we have the conifers, the largest one, as far as the 4 phyla or 4 clades that are found within the gymnosperms. So there's a wide variety of these plants, but they are all share several common features. Number one is that they are typically adapted to a drier climate. And while that may seem a contradiction, because you think, well, evergreens grow, conifers grow primarily in the northern hemisphere, at least, in what is known as the conifer belt. This is a broad belt that spans the northern hemisphere. In the northern part of North America and on up into Canada, across Europe, a big belt, although many of the forests are now lost into Siberia. There is still a lot of the native conifer belt, and this girdles the northern hemisphere. And you associate that with the presence of a lot of snow, and you would think, well, that means there's plenty of water. But in fact, snow is a very poor source of water, because once you melt snow, the amount of water that you get from that snow is small in terms of volume, because when water freezes, it expands in volume. So when you melt it and get the water back, you have a greatly reduced volume of water compared to what you started with, particularly with snow. And so the conifers as a group that grow in this conifer belt are very well adapted to living in regions of low water availability or restricted water availability. That's why they have needles. Needles are leaves that are modified to reduce water loss. If you look at a needle under the microscope, and hopefully you look at the images of the needles in the lab last week, you'll notice that there's a groove that runs the length of the needle on the underside. That's where the stomata are located, the openings that allow gas exchange and also lead to the loss of water via the leaves. Because they're in this groove, you get very little airflow across the stomata, so you get very little evaporative loss of water. At the same time, the needles are covered by a thick waxy layer, and that also reduces the loss of water. The needles themselves while we say that these trees are evergreens, that doesn't imply that they don't lose their leaves or they lose their needles. They do, they just lose a few at a time rather than dropping all of them at once and then growing a new set next spring. What is the advantage of being an evergreen? Well, so long as the environmental conditions are suitable, they can carry out photosynthesis all year round. So even in the middle of winter, if it warms up and there's enough sunlight, they can continue to carry out photosynthesis because they still have their leaves attached. And their leaves, being needles, resist freezing and also resist the accumulation of snow, so they're not going to break their branches and lose their leaves that way. So all in all, conifers truly are adapted to this sort of an environment. Does that mean that conifers don't grow outside of the conifer belt? Of course not. We have conifers here in Florida. Conifers have a worldwide distribution. And as you'll see, there is an ancient type of conifer that has been rediscovered as a quote unquote living fossil in the last 40 years, 30, 40 years or so. That grows in Australia in an area that does get some snow, but also gets a lot of high temperature. More of that to come in a moment. What also we find within the conifers are the tallest on average trees, the redwoods, growing to around 400 feet in height on average. The largest by volume, the giant sequoias. There's enough timber in an average giant sequoia to frame out some 1,500 houses. So that's a large volume of timber. And because the branches are only located in the upper part of the tree, it represents a lot of timber that doesn't have imperfections in it. And then also the oldest on average living trees. These are the bristlecone pines, the oldest of which is over 4,000 years. So it was already growing strong when the pyramids were being built. And what is interesting is that if you look if you are familiar with the geography of California, you find all three of these trees within close approximation of each other within California. So if you go to Northern California, which is where you find the redwoods, and you look in profile at the geography of this region, let's see if I can draw this out for you. You have the coastal plain, you have the Sierra Nevadas, the Central Valley, the inland mountain range, and then you get into the inland desert. So the redwoods are here on the coastal plain. The sequoias grow on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas, and then the bristlecones are on the eastern side of the inland mountain range, and down here is Death Valley. And if you were to time your drive well enough and take the right roads, you could actually visit the redwoods, the sequoias, and the bristlecones all in one day. They are that close to each other. I had the opportunity to visit the sequoias and the bristlecones in a single day because I went camping with some colleagues in the eastern Sierra Nevadas amongst the sequoias, and the area where the bristlecones are growing, a region known as the White Mountains, who's just nearby. You have to drive up over 11,000 feet to reach the bristlecones, but it's relatively easy to do. You can do so in a car. And within the national park that protects the bristlecones, you can find the grove of trees that contains the oldest tree, but they will not tell you which is the oldest tree, known as the Methuselah tree, because of their experience with labeling the tallest redwood, which was known as the General Sherman. Because having labeled the General Sherman, they found that people were taking souvenirs. And also they put a small wooden fence around the General Sherman, which meant that people would walk around the tree looking up at it and marveling at how tall it was, not realizing that all of those people walking around the base of the tree were compacting the soil around the roots of the tree, because redwoods may be tall trees, but their roots are very shallow in the ground. And so all of those people over the years compacted the soil down around the roots and eventually started to kill off some of the root system. And about 30 years ago, I believe it is now, about the top 25 to 30 feet of the tree died and fell off. Now, we do know of some taller redwoods today because someone did a complete survey of the full length of the redwood range from Northern California into Southern Oregon, and found several taller trees in amongst the redwoods growing in far Northern California and into Southern Oregon, but they're not advertising where those are because they don't want to lose these trees. So that's the reason why you can go to the bristlecones and see the grove of trees where the oldest tree is, but you can't actually figure out which it is because they simply do not want to tell you so that you can't take samples, souvenirs. So why? Well, here's the sequoia, and you can see how big this is. Old growth sequoias. I have a photo of an old growth sequoia in the Sequoia National Park, where one of the old Lincoln Continentals is parked completely in a tunnel carved through the trunk of the tree. And the reason why that works is because the only living part of the tree is the actual outer layer, the bark and the growing part of the tree immediately underneath the bark. Remember, the inner part of the tree is wood. That's all dead cells. That's just cell walls. And so if you carve that out but leave the bark intact, the tree will continue to grow. In fact, in one of my trips up through California and into Oregon and on up into Washington, we visited a souvenir store that was once someone's house that was actually built inside the trunk of a living redwood tree. It had been burnt out by a fire, but had left the outside layer of the tree intact, so it was still alive. It had just burnt the inner part of the tree and created a hollow space that someone had built a small residence in, and eventually that was turned into a gift shop. And you can see some other members of the conifers here. But here's a bristlecone, and you can see why it would not be wise to let people take souvenirs of the bristlecone, because the part of the tree that is actually alive is a very small part of the tree compared to the whole tree. And if you start damaging that living part of the tree, you'll kill the tree off. And you can see just how hostile the environment is for bristlecones, which is probably the reason why they're so old. They grow very slowly because it's a very hostile environment. And the slower you grow, the older you'll get. And the bristlecones are a really good example of this. Junipers are one of the few examples of a conifer that we actually eat. Another example, so another edible conifer is rosemary. And you eat the needles. So when you use rosemary in a dish, whether you use it fresh or whether you use it dried, you're actually eating the needles. And so those are used as a spicing. The last conifer here is the one that is the living fossil, called the Wollemi pine. There is a small grove located in what is in a national park that's about 80 miles northwest of Sydney, called Wollamai National Park. These grow in a steep valley, which is probably the reason why they're still extant, because they were not discovered until the mid-1990s. There are only about 30 or 40 trees in the native stand, but fortunately, once they were discovered, they were put under protection. The location is kept secret, although we do know that some people have managed to find their way in there because, like all humans, we leave our trash behind. But the idea here is to stop the import of fungal spores or other pathogen spores that might otherwise kill these trees, because there's so few of them, and this is the only known location in which they grow. Fortunately, they are very amenable to cloning, and they have been cloned, and you can actually buy clones if you want to grow one in your backyard. And I've had the opportunity to see one of these trees, not in the original stand, because I never had access to that valley, although I knew someone who did. But I've seen some of the clones, and in fact, the person that I know who knows where the valley is located and has access to it could have, if he'd played his cards correctly, been the one who discovered these. He was a fellow graduate student and friend of mine at my university who was doing a degree in geography. And in his degree, he was running what is referred to as a transect. That is a line that you draw across the landscape, and you walk that line, recording the geography and the plant and animals that you find, the habitats and the ecosystems that you transit as you're walking along the transit line, the transect line. And his transect headed directly towards the valley where we now know the Wollamai pines are located. But he stopped his transect one valley short of the valley where the Wollamai pines are located. If he'd carried his line one valley further, he would have discovered the Wollamai pines, because he would have almost certainly been the first modern European to enter the valley and therefore discover the pines. And they are, for all intents and purposes, living fossils, because the only other representatives other than these 30 to 40 trees are Wollamai pines from the fossil record. And they do look distinctly different from modern conifers. They do have needle-like leaves, but they're more fleshy than the typical conifer needle. They don't have very distinctive cone structures when they reproduce. That sets them aside from modern conifers, but they are nonetheless conifers. So when we take a look at the pine life cycle, and I've got a number of slides coming up now that document the pine life cycle, but I'm going to jump over all of those slides. Remember, you can pull the PowerPoint from Canvas. It's available for you as a link in Canvas, and you can download it. You can also watch it online if you want to, but I'm going to pull it. I'm going to jump through all of this and just go to the diagram and talk you through the diagram. You can read up more of the details of the life cycle from the textbook. It's not difficult to understand. So if we start with the sporophyte, which is where we would typically start, conifers are unique amongst the gymnosperms in that rather than having two separate genders as far as the sporophytes are concerned, what they have on the sporophyte are two separate gender-based branches. So there are male branches and there are female branches. The male branches produce the staminate cones, the pollen-producing cones, and the female branches produce the ovulate cones, or the egg-producing cones. Now, the ovulate cones are the ones that you're most familiar with, because those are the ones that remain on the tree for an extended period of time. The staminate cones do not. They only appear during the season or during the year that they are going to distribute their pollen. So they will emerge at the beginning of the growing season of that particular year, in spring. They will develop over the course of the year. They will remain somewhat dormant during the winter period of that year, and in the following spring, they will release their pollen, much to the distress of any of us who have pollen allergies to conifer pollen. And also will leave a thick yellow coat of pollen all over your car if you have it parked outside. These are tiny little cones. But being cones, remember, the leaves are sporophylls. In this case, we refer to them as microsporophylls because they contain the microsporangia that produce the microsporocytes that give rise to the microspores. Lots of micros here. The ovulate cones last on the tree a lot longer because it turns out that it takes about 3 years to complete the life cycle as far as conifers are concerned. So let me put a note here. Takes about that. This is not going to turn out well. They shouldn't have done that, I think. Yeah, let's just do that. And we're back. Takes about, just make sure that we're recording still. Yeah. Takes about, so you got all of that, 3 years to complete life cycle. So that's one of the things to bear in mind for conifer life cycle. So we know what's going on for the first year as far as the staminate cones are concerned. They appear as very immature cones at the beginning of the spring of year 1. They develop, and within the microsporangia, the pollen grains develop, so that the following spring, at the end of that first year, the pollen can be released to fall on the ovulate cones. During that first year, within the ovulate cones, at the base of the sporophylls, which are known as megasporophylls, the ovules develop. Usually there is 1 or 2 ovules at the base of each of the sporophylls. So the typical conifer that we have here in Florida usually has 2 ovules located at the base of each megasporophyll. Within the ovule, you have the megasporangium, which gives rise to the megasporocyte, which is actually the origin of the megaspore, which will be produced once the pollen grain arrives within the ovulate cone and enters in through the micropyle at the base of the ovule, in that little opening at the base of the integuments that surround the ovule. The pollen grain germinates and begins forming the pollen tube that will ultimately deliver the sperm nucleus to the egg for the purpose of fertilization. The arrival of the pollen grain, which is referred to as pollination. Fertilization is the combining together of the 2 haploid nuclei, but the arrival of the pollen is termed pollination. So the pollen grain, once it enters in through the micropyle, completes the pollination event, which allows it to germinate and start producing the pollen tube. During year 2, as that pollen tube starts to digest its way through the material that is derived from the megasporangium, known as the nucellus, meiosis is triggered within the megasporocyte, which gives rise to the megaspore. That is going to then produce the female gametophyte, which is a quasi-multicellular structure. Within that structure, a single cell will be identified as the archegonium, which will then produce the egg cell and the haplonucleus of the egg cell. When the pollen tube arrives at the egg cell, it fuses with the egg cell and discharges its single sperm nucleus into the egg cell, and fertilization takes place. That marks the end of year 2. During year 3, within the ovule, the now diploid zygote starts to divide by mitosis and develops into the little embryonic plant that is going to be encapsulated within the seed. At the same time, nutritive material in the form of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are deposited within the what was megaspore, and starts to expand that material. And remember, the megaspore is surrounded by the sporopollenin containing coat or spore wall that's protecting all of this and preventing it from drying out, and will continue to do so once the seed is ultimately released into the environment underneath the seed coat. So the food reserves are being laid on within the developing seed. The embryonic plant is continuing to grow. Eventually it reaches its maturity, containing embryonic seed leaves, a stem and a root, and some adequate food reserves. Now, in conifer seeds, the amount of food reserves is quite small compared to what we're going to see in angiosperms. So the gymnosperm embryos need to start growing relatively quickly and begin photosynthesis if they are going to survive. Their problem is that they are falling underneath a mature sporophyte. If they were to fall directly to the floor of the forest, they would be in competition with the mature sporophyte for access to light and other resources, and they would probably not survive. So many gymnosperms, and conifers particularly, have mechanisms for increasing the distribution of the seeds. So one way is to stop the seeds from falling directly to the ground, and I talked a little bit about that earlier. And so here you can see within this diagram now the extension of the integument that forms that airfoil structure that allows the seed to spin in a helicopter fashion down to the ground. So it falls more slowly. That gives the air currents time to push the seed sideways and out from underneath the coverage of the mature sporophyte. Another way is through the action of seed eaters like squirrels and so forth. Squirrels will actually eat green conifer cones. You expect that the seeds are probably only going to be mature when the cone dries out and the sporophylls open up to release them. And that is generally true. But in some species, particularly those that are used as a food resource by squirrels, the squirrels have adapted to be able to eat the cones in spite of all the unappetizing material that the cones produce to try and stop the squirrels from eating them in the form of resins and so forth. Under those circumstances, the seeds mature early. And if you take a look at the cones that the squirrels chew on, they don't necessarily eat everything. And that provides an opportunity, but they do throw the cones away, which provides another opportunity for further distribution. But generally, it's all about seed distribution by wind. Just as the pollen is distributed by wind, so the seeds are distributed by wind. So at the end of year 3, in the spring that marks the end of year 3, the seeds are released and make their way to the ground. If they are in a suitable environment, they will germinate, and hopefully they have moved far enough away from the mature sporophyte to allow them to grow and perhaps start to compete in their own right for resources. So that's the general conifer life cycle as seen in a conifer, a pine. Which brings us to our next break. And again, this will be a proper break. I'll stop the recording and see you on the other side of the break to answer this concept check. So now that we've been over the pine life cycle and we've seen how the pine life cycle plays out over the course of 3 years, the concept check question asks us to identify where in the pine life cycle we see reflected the 5 adaptations that are shared by all seed plants. If in fact these 5 adaptations are central to the success of seed plants, then we should be able to identify the parts of the life cycle that reflect those 5 derived adaptations. So I'll see you on the other side of the break with the answers to this question.